Good evening, Dom. I would like to share a story from my school days. During high school, I had two close friends, Robert and John. We spent a lot of time together, and around graduation time, Robert had to move to Lexington, South Carolina with his family due to his father's work. After he finally moved, John and I were invited to spend a weekend at Robert's new house. With nothing much to do, we decided to explore the nearby forest and fields and ended up finding a very beautiful river. It was a calm and pleasant place, but to our surprise, we ended up getting lost. We decided to follow the course of the river, not knowing if we were going upstream or downstream, and we didn't hear any sound of civilization around. We started to worry and wanted to find a phone to call Robert's parents to come pick us up, but we couldn't find any road. We kept following the river and arrived at an old building that looked like a church, built with very aged red bricks, with a dirt road and a parking lot overgrown with weeds. We decided to go in, thinking we might find someone and ask to use the phone to make a call. In the parking lot, there were 4 old cars from the 70s or 80s, very dirty and rusted, all with flat or missing tires. They were lined up, and they were all white, or at least had been at some point. As we approached the church, we heard gospel music and voices singing. Relieved to find someone there, we entered the building, which was visibly old and poorly maintained. We peeked into the main hall and saw about 24 people, all dressed simply, but clearly in their best clothes, despite their humble appearance. As soon as we crossed the door, an old lady with white hair who was playing the piano stopped playing and looked at us without any expression. What happened next deeply marked me. Everyone in the church stopped singing, lowered their hymn books, and slowly turned their cold, unwelcoming gazes towards us. Nervous, Robert said, "Sorry to interrupt, we just wanted to use the phone to call my parents to pick us up." No one responded, and the silence was unsettling, except for the sound of the wooden pews creaking under the weight of the people. With no other option, we backed out and let the door close behind us, exchanging frightened glances. We walked back along the dirt road, and it was only then that John remarked, "There were no crosses or any other Christian symbols inside the church." We looked back and saw that about a dozen men had come out and were watching us from the church entrance. That filled us with immense fear, and we started running down the road for a good 30 minutes. Finally, we arrived at a very old gas station, one of those full-service types. We went in and saw that the shelves were almost empty, covered in dust. A very tanned man wearing a dirty baseball cap was behind the counter reading a very old book. He looked up and said, "You guys are lost, right? Follow the road you came from, turn left at the telephone pole, and follow it to the highway." We thanked him and left quickly. As we walked away, we looked back and saw the man standing at the gas station door, staring at us with a smile that revealed rotten teeth. We got to the telephone pole, turned right, and followed the trail to the highway. It was already dark by the time we got there, and after some time trying to hitch a ride, a police officer saw us and stopped. We explained the situation, and when he heard Robert's address, the officer whistled and said, "You were really far away." It took another 30 minutes for him to drop us back at Robert's house, and during the ride he warned us to be careful, as some strange people live in those forests. Before we move on to the next story, if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell to receive the upcoming stories. Your presence is important, and your support is essential. Well, let's continue. About 8 years ago, something quite silly happened to me and 2 friends, Leo and Isaac. Back then, we did a lot of meaningless things to pass the time. Nowadays, I no longer talk to Leo, but Isaac and I still keep in touch, and this story comes up from time to time. We were 19 years old, living in New Jersey. There were many abandoned houses in our town, and at the top of a mountain road, not far from where we lived, there was a decommissioned church. The locals knew the place well, a church on a closed road that had been abandoned for years. I live in Florida now, so I don't know if it still exists or what state it's in. Leo, Isaac, and I, always looking for thrills and a bit of trouble, had the brilliant idea of bringing a Ouija board to the church one night. It was October, so it felt like the right thing to do at that time of year. Isaac had a Ouija board at home, so he brought it. I was the driver that night, first picking up Leo, then Isaac, and we headed to the church. The road to the church was blocked, so we had to park on the side and walk the rest of the way. At first, we used a flashlight, being careful not to overdo it to avoid drawing attention, but once we reached the top of the hill, we turned on our flashlights. The church was surrounded by trees and had a gravel parking lot beside it. It had been broken into many times before, the walls were covered in graffiti, and the front door, though slightly open, was hard to push. We had to pull it together because it dragged on the ground. Once inside, we took a quick look around with our flashlights to make sure we were alone. The atmosphere was definitely gloomy. Isaac set up the board on the floor and pulled 3 candles out of his backpack, laughing and saying, "This will make the mood more intense." He placed them in a triangle around the board, and after lighting them, we turned off the flashlights. The only light came from the candles, casting a faint and eerie glow. It was hard to see more than a few feet ahead. We started moving the board. Isaac did most of the talking, starting with the classic, "Is anyone there?" and other typical Ouija questions. The planchette began to move and we all laughed. I knew someone was moving it on purpose. It's almost impossible to play with a Ouija board without a friend moving the planchette. Even so, we played along, and words started to be spelled out. Suddenly, we heard a strange sound coming from the church altar, something like wood breaking. It was loud and seemed like it was caused by someone. We immediately pointed our flashlights at the altar, but there was no one there. I think we were all scared, but since the church was old and deteriorating, strange noises weren't a huge surprise. We decided to keep going. We took turns asking questions, but after that noise, the planchette didn't move anymore. We were all more tense. Sometime later, the silence was broken by another noise coming from the altar, but before we could shine our lights, something fell on the board. It was a stone, the size of a golf ball. We had all been holding the planchette just seconds before. No one could have thrown that stone. The reaction was immediate. We ran out of the church, leaving the board and the candles behind. We ran down the hill to my car and, without looking back, headed straight to Leo's house. We stayed there, inside the car, discussing what had just happened for a long time. Isaac, who is super religious and superstitious, was convinced we had summoned a spirit. I, on the other hand, believed there was someone else in the church, which to me is just as scary. The next day, Isaac and Leo went back to get the board, but it had disappeared. The candles were still there, but the board was gone. It was, without a doubt, the scariest experience I've ever had. This happened in a very rural area of Warren County, Georgia. My girlfriend Olivia and I were exploring the area, trying to figure out if it would be a place where we'd like to live. The environment was exactly what we were looking for, peaceful and spacious. We are both Roman Catholics, though she enjoys attending church more than I do. It was a weekday, in the middle of the afternoon, and the road was almost empty. Since Olivia has been an equestrian for many years, we were checking out several key locations before making any decision to move, especially because she wanted a rural space with a barn for her horses. After seeing a few properties for sale, we passed by a small charming church along a very isolated road. Several cars were parked there, which caught our attention. The church was near one of the last properties we visited, so Olivia suggested we check if there was a mass going on to get a feel for the atmosphere. I parked the car next to an old red minivan in a dirt parking lot. Most of the vehicles there were old. I mentioned this to Olivia, who agreed, saying, "It's probably a low-income area." We entered the church, which was small as we had imagined. There were only 5 rows of pews, split in the middle by a central aisle. Inside, there were about 20 people, but not elderly like in many masses. What caught our attention the most was that most of the people there seemed to be between 30 and 40 years old. Everyone was silent, possibly in prayer. As we settled in the last row, a few people began casting curious glances at us. As others noticed these glances, they also turned their heads toward us. Olivia and I exchanged suspicious looks, and not knowing what else to do, we just smiled back, but no one returned the gesture. The atmosphere didn't feel welcoming, and I noticed that no one was dressed appropriately for a mass. That's when I realized the absence of women, except for Olivia. All the stares seemed focused on her. A masked man standing at the front where the altar would normally be stepped forward and asked, "Who invited you?" I stepped up and explained that we were just passing by, saw what seemed like a mass and decided to join. But clearly that man was not a priest, and this was not a Catholic church. He said, "You need to leave now." Suddenly, everyone in the church was staring intently at us. I immediately said to Olivia, "Let's go." We stood up and left quickly. As soon as we got in the car, I noticed someone exiting the building and getting into a van. We left the parking lot without wasting any time, but when I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw that the grey van was following us. I asked Olivia to look up the address for the Warren County Sheriff's Office on the GPS, and we drove straight there. The van followed us the whole way. It wasn't right on our tail, but it kept enough distance to make it clear that they were watching us. As soon as we pulled into the public safety parking lot, the van continued down the road. When it drove off, we headed back home and never considered the idea of living in Warren County again. Clearly, we stumbled into some kind of strange gathering, but I still don't understand why they followed us, or why the meeting was happening in broad daylight with the door unlocked. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a like. It's really important. Well, let's continue. When I was a Boy Scout, our meetings always took place at a Catholic primary school, either in the gymnasium or in a nearby room. I was about 8 years old when this episode happened, and it still disturbs me to this day. But before explaining why I'm sharing this, let's start from the beginning. It all began a few days earlier when I went to Mass with my mother and brother, as we did every 2 weeks. We usually arrived late, so we'd sit in the back or near the doors if there was no space. That day we sat at the end of the back pews. My mother went in first, followed by my brother, and I sat at the edge. At some point during the Mass, I noticed an elderly man leaning against the wall to my left. He wore glasses and had a white mustache. He was staring at me. When our eyes met, he smiled, but what caught my attention was the strange and creepy expression he made, as if he was trying to be funny. Even at just 8 years old, it made me feel very uncomfortable. I tried to ignore it, but he kept staring at me, so I looked back, and once again, he made another bizarre face, probably thinking it would be funny, but it just made me feel more uneasy. My mother noticed this time, nudged my shoulder and whispered, "Ignore it." I think she also gave him a stern look. After that, the man disappeared for a while, and I didn't see him again until I went to receive communion. When I returned to my seat, there he was again, smiling and staring at me the whole time until I sat down. My mother noticed again, and since we had already received communion, we decided to leave. On the way back, she commented, "I didn't like the way he was looking at us, especially at you." Now, moving on to the scout meetings. Toward the end of our activities, we usually played small games or held competitions, and that day we were doing a treasure hunt. The items to be found were all related to scouting, like a first aid kit, rope, flashlight, and so on. We were divided into 2 teams, each given a list of items. The team that found the most objects would win. We spread out across the gym, cafeteria, and some adjacent rooms. I was running through the halls, exploring areas I had never seen before, but I wasn't having any luck finding anything. I ended up in a narrow hallway behind the cafeteria, near the kitchen. There was an ice cream freezer full of popsicles. I decided to check if any of the items were inside. There was nothing, but I thought I'd grab a popsicle. That's when I heard a man's voice to my right. When I looked, I saw it was the man from the church, the same one from a few days earlier. He approached smiling and said something like, "Don't let anyone see you taking that." He closed the freezer door and grabbed my hand, saying, "I have better treats in the back, where the kids aren't allowed to go." I pulled my hand, trying to get away, but he grabbed my wrist tighter, saying, "Shh, calm down." I screamed for help, and he let go, asking me to stop making a scene. I ran back to the gym and told the scoutmaster what had happened. Thankfully, he was a very attentive man, perhaps because he was a father too. He reported the incident to my mother, and I told her it was the same man from the church. My scoutmaster helped my mother report the man to the church. We found out that he worked for the church, though I'm not sure exactly what he did there. He lived on the church grounds, which explained his constant presence. The most frightening thing was that later accusations surfaced that he had touched an altar boy inappropriately. I feel disgusted when I think about what could have happened to me if I had followed that man. I don't know if he was ever arrested, but I know the church severed ties with him after the incident. I'm a mother of 3, so our grocery shopping tends to be quite large. My husband works for a tech company, while I currently stay at home taking care of the kids, who are 10, 7, and 3 years old. I go to the supermarket at least twice a week, usually to King Cullen, which is close to home, but sometimes I also go to Target, which is a bit further. In our small town, these two are pretty much the only grocery stores. Just to give a bit more context, our family is Italian and I'm 40 years old. This happened when I was still 39, so it wasn't that long ago. One day, I was running late for grocery shopping and ended up leaving much later than usual. King Cullen closes at 10 p.m. and it was already past 9 p.m. when I arrived with my coupons and flyers. The kids had been complaining about the lack of food at home, so I needed to make a quick shopping run. Normally, I would have to bring my 3-year-old daughter Eleanor with me, but since my husband was already home, it was the first time in a while that I could shop alone, which felt like a luxury. When I arrived at the store, there were hardly any people left since it was about to close. I grabbed a cart and started walking down the aisles, picking up everything on my list and taking advantage of the deals. I was in the cereal aisle when I felt someone tap me on the shoulder, which startled me. When I turned around, I saw a tanned man about my height, wearing a baseball cap, a black t-shirt, and a red zip-up hoodie, along with jeans. He laughed and apologized for scaring me, explaining, "I was looking for a specific kind of chips which are in your cart. Where did you find them?" I told him which aisle they were in, but he insisted, "I already looked there and didn't see them." So I took him to the exact spot where I had grabbed the item. He thanked me, smiling, despite having horrible breath, and I was about to return to my cart when he started talking about why he liked that brand of chips so much, something to do with the ingredients. I politely tried to show that I was busy and wanted to get back to my shopping, but he didn't seem to catch on. Then, out of nowhere, he paused and said, "Wow, you're beautiful." I quickly thanked him and said I needed to get back to my shopping before the store closed. When I returned to my cart, I noticed that he continued to follow me, trying to make more conversation. That's when, as politely as I could, I said, "I'd like to continue shopping in peace." He finally seemed to get the message and walked away, but for the rest of my time in the store, I saw him walking through the aisles, always slowing down or stopping when he passed me. It made me feel quite uncomfortable, and I hurried to finish my shopping. When I was done, I went to the checkout, and while I was unloading my cart, the man showed up again, this time with just a few items, and stood right behind me in line. He didn't say anything else, but I could feel his eyes on me. I paid for my groceries as quickly as possible, and as I was leaving, I heard him say, "Have a good night, ma'am." I ignored him. As I was loading the groceries into my car, I noticed that he was sitting in the parking lot, watching me from inside an old Honda, which looked like it was about 30 years old. He didn't start the car, he just sat there. After loading everything, I got into my car and drove off. I kept checking my rearview mirror several times and didn't see any headlights following me, so I relaxed. But when I parked at home, I noticed a car with its headlights off, moving slowly down the street, stopping a few houses down. It looked like the same Honda from the parking lot. I quickly went inside and called my husband, who came downstairs worried. I told him that I had been followed, and he rushed out to the porch, but the car had already driven off. The following weekend, late at night, we heard noises outside coming from the side yard. I woke my husband, who went to the window and saw a man trying to open the side gate. When the guy realized the window was opening, he ran. My husband grabbed a baseball bat and chased after him, but when he came back, he said he had seen the car speeding down the street and tried to follow it. He described the exact same Honda I had seen in the King Cullen parking lot. We called the police, and an officer came quickly, but we never saw that man again. Still, it's unsettling to know that someone like that knows where we live. During college, I worked at a supermarket that was open 24 hours. Some colleagues always ended up stuck in the worst shifts, those in the middle of the night. I believed that being in college and only 20 years old, my boss wouldn't assign me to those kinds of shifts. However, after reviewing my class schedule and realizing that I was free on Mondays and Wednesdays, I guess I became the perfect target to cover the night shift from time to time. One time I saw that I was scheduled for a Tuesday night from midnight to 8 a.m. I checked the schedule several times to make sure I wasn't mistaken. When I asked my supervisor why I had been placed on that shift, he simply replied, "Since you're over 18, there aren't many other options." I thought about quitting, but I needed the money and the job. I decided I would do that shift, and then let them know I couldn't do it anymore as I needed to focus on my studies. I arrived at the store around midnight to replace Amanda. At that hour, half of the store's lights were off to save energy. I was surprised by how many customers were still there at that time. But after 1 a.m., the place was practically deserted, with only a few customers showing up now and then. As the night went on, the store emptied out even more, and by 2 a.m., I realized I had been alone for over an hour. I started to wonder if there were any other employees in the building. I couldn't imagine they would leave a 20-year-old alone to take care of everything. Occasionally, a bald man who looked like a manager would walk by the registers. He carried a keychain full of keys attached to his pants and a small backpack in his hand. I decided to approach him and asked, "Are you the manager?" He responded with a question, asking if it was my first day. I explained that it was my first night shift. Without telling me his name, he shook my hand and asked me to go to the warehouse and organize the pallets, saying he would take care of the front of the store. Not quite sure what he meant. I headed to the warehouse. As I walked away, I saw the man fiddling with something at the store's front door, as if he was trying to lock it. When I arrived at the warehouse, I found a tall man wearing a manager's vest with the supermarket's name. He introduced himself as Rob, the night manager. I mentioned that I thought the man at the front was the manager, but he looked confused and asked me to show him who I was talking about, as he was the only manager on duty that night. Before we could leave the warehouse, all the store lights went out. Rob asked me to wait while he went to check what was going on. I watched as he disappeared into the dark store, illuminated only by the refrigerator lights. I sat on a box and started texting some friends, telling them what was happening. Then, I heard a door open on the other side of the warehouse, near the freezer. I listened closely, trying to hear better when slow, heavy footsteps began approaching, followed by a voice calling, "Hey kid, are you there?" But that wasn't Rob's voice. It was the voice of the bald man. I quickly stood up and silently exited through the warehouse doors. I ran to the front of the store looking for Rob, but he wasn't there. I shouted his name, but there was no answer. I grabbed my jacket and tried to open the store door, but it was locked. When I heard footsteps behind me, I turned, ready to scream, but it was Rob. He unlocked the door and, whispering with concern, asked me to get out of there quickly. We left the store and Rob immediately called the police. He told them he thought an armed man had locked himself in the store and was trying to rob it. I asked him to tell the police that I thought the man intended to harm me, which he relayed to the operator. Rob suggested that I wait in my car or leave, probably so the store wouldn't be held accountable if something happened. I went to my car and watched. In less than 10 minutes, 4 police cars arrived. I didn't stay to see what happened. I left. When I returned to work, the supervisor told me everything. The security cameras showed the bald man wandering around the store, checking to see if it was clear to act. After locking the doors, he cut the lights and headed straight for the warehouse where I was. That scared me because if he had been armed, he could have done something much worse. He escaped through the warehouse's emergency exit just before the police arrived. After that, I never worked the night shift again, but I stayed at the job for a few more months. I don't know if the man was ever identified. I worked as a night stalker at a supermarket in a somewhat rural town. The store, called Great American, was the biggest and most well-known in the region. My shift started as soon as the store closed around 10 p.m. and went until 3 a.m. at the latest. During that time, I organized the shelves and made sure everything was ready for the next day of business. Since I was responsible for the store after hours, I always had the keys. The team consisted of 2 people, me and a co-worker who could be Terry, Carter, or Carlos. That night, I was supposed to work with Terry. I arrived at the store through the back, where all the stock awaited to be replenished. I started by using the pallet jack to take a pallet of boxes to the sales floor. I began in the bread and nuts aisle, moving the older bread to the front and placing the new ones in the back. That's when I realized I still hadn't seen Terry. I went to the back where we stored our belongings, but he wasn't there. To make it easier for him to enter, I left the back door slightly ajar with a wedge. After about half an hour of work, I noticed that Terry still hadn't shown up. I went back to the back area to check, and I saw that the door was closed. I thought that meant Terry was somewhere in the store. When I opened the door, I noticed the wedge was outside, which I found strange since he should have brought it inside. I called out for Terry, but he didn't answer. I decided to call him. Terry answered with a voice that sounded like he had just woken up. I asked if he was at work, and he told me, "I'm not coming in. I'm sick." At that moment, a chill ran down my spine. I mentioned that someone had closed the door, but he replied, "The wedge could have fallen out on its own. No one else was scheduled to work that night." I wished him well, and we hung up. Still suspicious, I went to check if there was anyone in the back of the store, but I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. I went back to work, but the feeling of unease wouldn't leave me. While restocking the bread aisle, a sound echoed from the other side of the store. Someone had to be there. I stood up and walked to the main aisle where I could see all the other aisles. I stood there for a moment, and on the other side, in the dairy aisle, a man dressed in black walked by, looking directly at me. My heart raced. It was like that scene from the movie Signs when the alien shows up at the party. I tried to think rationally. Maybe it was someone covering Terry's shift, something my boss forgot to tell me. I started walking quickly down the aisle, shouting, "Excuse me," loudly. I looked down the aisles to my left as I passed, trying to spot the person. In one of them, there he was, standing at the end of the aisle, staring at me. When he saw me, he disappeared in the direction I had just come from. I called out again and started running, but I still hadn't seen his face clearly. When I got near the checkout area, I looked toward where he had gone, and there he was, half hidden behind a shelf. His mouth was open, and he was waving for me to come closer, but without saying a word. His face gave me the creeps. I asked, "Who are you?" But he vanished from sight. I wasn't being paid enough for this. I ran to my car and called my boss, explaining that there was a strange person in the store. He suggested I try to get him out or call the police. I wasn't about to confront someone that strange, so I called 911 and waited in my car until the police arrived. When the officer showed up, I went inside with him to look for the man. There he was again, standing in one of the aisles as if he were playing around. The officer ordered him to come closer, and surprisingly, he obeyed. He was handcuffed, and without a doubt, he was the weirdest person I've ever seen. He smiled at me while licking his lips. He had huge dark circles under his eyes. When the officer asked him what he was doing, he simply replied, "I was looking for a snack." The look he gave me as he was taken away is something I'll never forget, a menacing and sinister smile. After that, I went back to work. Needless to say, I never left the doors open again.